They thought she was just a diversity hire from the lower 48, a rookie nurse with soft hands and a quiet voice. The Marines at Fort Glacier joked she'd faint at the first sign of a frostbitten toe. But when the power died and the screaming started, they didn't find a victim, they found a nightmare. The smugglers thought they had broken into a hospital. They didn't realize they had walked straight into her kill zone. The Alaskan winter doesn't just get cold, it tries to erase you. At Fort Glacier Medical Outpost, the wind doesn't blow, it screams. It claws at the corrugated steel walls like a dying animal trying to get inside, rattling windows that have already frozen into thick, milky sheets of ice. This wasn't a place for the weak. It was a bunker, 3 hours from the nearest town and a lifetime away from backup. The Marines stationed here, hardened men like Corporal Miller and SGT. Jackson joked that if the world ended, they'd be the last to know and the first to starve. Then there was Ava. She moved through the halls with a tray of IV fluids balanced against her hip, her steps so quiet they were almost non-existent. Light blue scrubs, hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. No rank, no medals, no history. To the men of the 3rd Battalion, she was just the rookie. Evening, nurse, Miller grinned as she passed triage, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Cold enough for you, or do we need to turn up the heater? Ava didn't stop. She didn't even look at him. She just gave a small, distant smile. It gets colder around 300, Corporal, she said softly. Miller blinked, his grin faltering. Yeah, how do you? But she was already gone. No one noticed how she paused at the end of the corridor, not long enough to be suspicious, just long enough to glance at the reinforced windows overlooking the frozen runway. Her eyes weren't looking at the snow, they were measuring it, tracking the height of the drifts, calculating the distance to the tree line, judging the visibility. Her fingers flexed once, a rhythmic twitch, like she was counting heartbeats or seconds on a timer. To the Marines, she was a nurse. To the mountain, she was a ghost. The first shadow. The hospital was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air right before a lightning strike. Monitors beeped. The massive basement generator hummed with a strained, mechanical groan. Inside the command office, Captain Reed was wrestling with a radio that sounded like it was drowning in static. Say again, Control, you're breaking up. Visibility is 0, he barked. Ava heard the static through 2 reinforced walls. Her hand tightened on her plastic tray just for a second. 10 minutes later, the first alarm chirped. It wasn't the red alert. It was the small, nagging chime of a perimeter motion sensor on the east fence. Probably a fox, Miller muttered, barely glancing at the monitor. They get bold when the storms hit. But then the second sensor tripped, then the third. Ava stopped mid-stride. She didn't look at the doors. She looked at the ceiling, her head tilted, listening for a sound deeper than the wind. The lights flickered, not out, just a dip, a test of the system. Ava set her tray down on a nearby gurney. Outside, buried beneath the howling gale and the whiteout conditions, something metal scraped against ice. The men coming through the snow weren't amateurs. They were the Northreach Syndicate, smugglers who moved high-end hardware and disappeared people through the frozen corridors of the Arctic. They had watched Fort Glacier for weeks. They knew the Marines trusted the weather more than their own sensors. They came low, white winter camo over tactical black gear, faces masked, boots wrapped in heavy cloth to muffle their footfalls. They moved with a synchronized, lethal grace that suggested they weren't just criminals, they were veterans who had traded their flags for a paycheck. Their intel said the hospital was a soft target. They were half right. The bridge. Inside, the Marines were still debating a routine weather report when the exterior floodlights died. Total darkness pressed against the glass. "We just lost perimeter cams," someone shouted from the security desk. The first gunshot didn't make a sound. The storm was too loud. It swallowed the crack of the suppressed rifle hole. The Marine standing guard at the secondary entrance didn't scream. He just stiffened, his brow furrowing as if he'd forgotten a word. The second shot found his throat. He hit the tile floor with a heavy metallic thud. His helmet clattered, the sound echoing down the hallway like a death knell. Blood, dark and hot, spread across the white floor far too fast. Contact! Chaos erupted. Boots slipped on the polished floors as Marines scrambled for cover, rifles coming up, hearts hammering against ribs. Someone grabbed the fallen Marine, dragging him behind a heavy steel gurney, their voice breaking as they screamed for a medic. But Ava was already gone. She didn't run for the exits. She didn't hide in a closet. She moved into a maintenance corridor, a narrow, dark vein of the building that most of the staff didn't even know existed. Her fingers brushed the wall, navigating the pitch black by touch alone. Her breathing didn't speed up. It slowed down, her world narrowed. The fear didn't take her, the focus did. This place again, she thought. Different building, same math. The smugglers breached the loading bay, confident. They had neutralized the outer watch. The Marines were being loud, reactive, and predictable. They never saw her. Up in an iced-over observation window, Ava lay prone. Her light blue scrubs were gone, replaced by a dark, high-altitude tactical kit she had hidden in a ceiling crawl space weeks ago. The rifle came together in her hands with practiced, mechanical silence. Every motion was economical. No wasted energy, no guilt, no hesitation. She checked the wind drift, erratic, snowfall dense, visibility poor. Good, she thought. I like it when they can't see what's coming. The lead smuggler stepped into the open, signaling his team to move toward the triage center. Ava adjusted her aim exactly 2 centimeters to the left. She squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked like a frozen branch snapping in the woods. The lead smuggler dropped face first into the snow, dead before his brain could even process the sound of the bullet. Inside the hospital, the Marines froze. "What the hell was that?" Miller shouted, his rifle shaking. Another smuggler fell backward, his chest punched inward as if he'd been hit by a freight train. Panic rippled through the attackers. They began firing blindly into the whiteout, their rounds chewing uselessly into the ice and steel. "Who's firing back?" a Marine whispered, stunned. Ava didn't answer, she just cycled the bolt. Target number 3 was moving too fast, trying to find cover behind a generator housing. She didn't rush. She didn't get emotional. She just waited for the rhythm. 3 shots, 3 down, clean. She wasn't counting out of pride. She was counting because, in her world, the only thing that kept you alive was the math. And the math said there were still 9 men inside. The Marines think they're being rescued by a guardian angel, but the smugglers, they're starting to realize there's a devil in the ward, and she's just getting started. The smoke was thick, but her vision was clearer than ever. The Marines were waiting for an order. The smugglers were waiting for a target. Neither realized that the rookie nurse they dismissed had already mapped out their grave. The hunt didn't start in the hallway. It started in her mind years ago. And today, the math was simple. 1 breath, 1 shot, 0 survivors. Inside the command room, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and fear. A young Marine stared at the security feed in utter disbelief, his hands hovering over the keyboard. "Sir," he stammered, his voice cracking, "I think someone out there is hunting them." Captain Reed, the duty officer, swallowed hard as he watched another white-clad figure collapse on the grainy monitor. "We don't have a sniper assigned to this sector," he whispered, more to himself than his men. The realization was unsettling, impossible to ignore, that someone in the building knew exactly what they were doing, and it wasn't the men in uniform. Ava didn't stay to watch them wonder. She shifted her position on the upper ledge, already anticipating the smugglers' next move. Professional teams don't stay in the open when they're being picked off by an invisible marksman. They change tactics. They go inside. They force close-quarters combat where a long rifle loses its edge. She abandoned the window, disappearing into the stairwell before anyone could even think to look for her. Downstairs, the smugglers breached the emergency entrance. The lead man kicked the door open with a heavy boot wrapped in white tape to muffle the sound. He came in with his rifle up, breath fogging thick inside his tactical mask, expecting to find panicked nurses and Marines scrambling for cover. Instead, the lights snapped on. Not a full, bright glow, but a dim, haunting amber that threw long, jagged shadows across the ward. Ava stood at the far end of the corridor, calm as a held breath. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't shaking. Her rifle was already shouldered, tucked into the pocket of her gear like it was an extension of her own bone. The smuggler fired first. The rounds chewed into the drywall behind her, sending dust flying. He missed. Ava didn't. The shot was deafening indoors, a thunderclap that rattled the ceiling panels and sent a physical shockwave down the narrow hall. The smuggler didn't just fall, he was thrown backward, his rifle skidding across the tile like a discarded toy. His partner, stacked right behind him, froze, not out of fear, but out of pure, unadulterated confusion. This wasn't how the playbook was supposed to go. The psychology of the hunt. Inside the hospital's main wing, the Marines pushed the wounded back behind overturned gurneys and heavy steel carts. Weapons were trained on every doorway. Someone shouted for a medic, while SGT Jackson barked for a status count. Outside, the Alaskan storm howled louder, its roar sounding like a mockery of the sudden, desperate order trying to take shape inside the bunker. Ava moved like water. She wasn't running. She was sliding, stepping, and vanishing between cover points she had memorized weeks ago under the guise of learning the facility layout. She knew every blind spot in the security cameras, every creak in the floorboards. She dropped her rifle behind a structural column, switching to her sidearm in a single, fluid motion without even looking. She took a knee, her silhouette blending into the shadows of the vending machines. Two more smugglers rushed the corridor together, stacking tight and moving with professional synchronization. Ava didn't fire immediately. She waited. She let them come closer, feeling the vibration of their boots through the floor. She waited until the first man crossed the red line, the invisible mark in her mind where survival became impossible. 2 shots, 1 breath. Both men went down before they could even level their sights. A Marine watched from a nearby doorway, his eyes wide with awe and terror. "Who the hell is that?" he whispered to Miller. Miller just shook his head, his face pale. "That's not one of ours." Ava didn't hear them. She didn't care about their praise or their confusion. She was already listening for the change in the rhythm of the house. The smugglers had stopped charging. They were thinking now. They were adapting. And that made them dangerous. The fog of war. Up on the second floor, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the ventilation. A flashbang rolled across the nurse's station, detonating with a blinding, concussive roar. A young corpsman screamed as he hit the floor, his hands clamped over his ears, his equilibrium shattered by the blast. Ava flinched once, the white light searing her retinas, but she forced herself forward through the acrid haze. She passed a Marine crouched behind a supply cart, his eyes dinner plate wide. He looked up at her, saw the light blue scrubs now dusted with black soot and cordite, and blurted out, "Ma'am, you need to get back." Ava didn't argue, she didn't explain. She simply pressed a single finger to her lips in a gesture for silence. The Marine obeyed instantly. He didn't know why, but the look in her eyes wasn't the look of a nurse. It was the look of a commander who had seen the end of the world and survived it. Around the corner, two smugglers swept the ward, their rifles tracking the beds, checking every shadow for the ghost that was killing their team. They were hunting for something specific now. They weren't looking for the Marines anymore. They were looking for the shooter. Ava recognized the behavior instantly. It was a search and destroy pattern. She leaned out from the cover of a doorway, fired a single, calculated shot, and retreated before the echo had even finished bouncing off the walls. One smuggler went down, clutching his leg and screaming curses in a language Ava didn't bother to identify. His partner panicked, spraying a full magazine blindly into the hallway, the rounds chewing through plastic privacy curtains and metal bed frames. Ava waited. She counted the rounds, 17, 18, 19. When the mechanical click of an empty chamber reached her ears, she stepped out and ended it. 5, she whispered to the empty air. She took a breath, slower this time. Somewhere deep in her chest, an old, dormant part of her was fully awake. It was the part of her that didn't see people. It saw angles, windage, and heartbeats. The part that didn't ask for permission to exist. Downstairs, Captain Reed finally found his voice over the intercom. "All units, fall back to triage and hold. Whoever is engaging is buying us time." Buying time, Ava thought, a cold, dry smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I'm not buying time, Captain. I'm closing the account." The smugglers thought they were the wolves. They thought the snow was their cover. But in the heart of Fort Glacier, they were finding out that the most dangerous thing in the woods isn't the storm. It's the woman who knows how to use it. In the military, they teach you that every man has a breaking point. But Ava wasn't a man, and she had broken a long time ago. As the smugglers regroup in the loading bay, they realize they aren't fighting a soldier. They're fighting a shadow that strikes from the smoke. The Marines call it buying time. Ava calls it the harvest. And before the sun rises, the snow outside will be the only thing left that's white. The smugglers regrouped in the loading bay, the massive roll-up door rattling as the gale force winds tried to tear it from its tracks. Snow blew in through the half-open entrance, coating the tactical gear of the remaining men in a fine, crystalline powder. Their leader, a man with a jagged scar running beneath his mask, slammed a heavy fist into a steel crate. "This was supposed to be a quiet extraction," he snarled, his voice a gravelly rasp. "We're losing men to a ghost." One of his lieutenants shook his head, his eyes darting toward the darkened corridor they had just fled. "This isn't the Marines, boss. They're loud, they're reactive. This is someone else." He was right. The Marines were trained to hold lines. Ava was trained to erase them. The smugglers decided to change the variables. If they couldn't see their enemy, they would make sure their enemy couldn't see them either. They pulled canisters from their belts, thick, heavy-duty smoke grenades designed for urban pacification. With a series of metallic pops, thick, choking clouds of gray smoke began to pour into the hallways. The fire alarms, triggered by the density of the particulate, began to shriek, a high-pitched, rhythmic scream that made communication impossible. Then the sprinklers activated. Ice-cold water rained down from the ceiling, turning the polished tile floors into a slick, treacherous death trap. Visibility dropped to less than 3 feet. To any normal soldier, this was a nightmare of disorientation. To Ava, it was perfect cover. She dropped prone, her body pressing against the wet floor where the air was slightly clearer. She crawled beneath the churning layer of smoke, her breathing steady, her eyes burning from the chemicals, but focused with a lethal intensity. She wasn't just moving, she was hunting by vibration. She popped up directly behind a smuggler who was coughing into his hand, his mask pulled loose in a desperate attempt to catch a breath. One strike, silent, precise. 6, she whispered as he slumped into her arms. She didn't leave him there for the others to find. She dragged his body into a nearby supply alcove and without a shred of hesitation, stripped him of his ammunition and his radio. The word that changed everything. As she adjusted the stolen radio earpiece, it crackled to life for the first time. It wasn't the marine frequency, and it wasn't the smuggler's tactical chatter. "Ghost," a voice said. The word was distorted by heavy interference and the howl of the storm, but it hit Ava like a physical blow. She froze, her hand hovering over the dial. That name hadn't been spoken aloud in 5 years, not since the day she'd officially died in a rain-swept valley halfway across the world. "We know you're there," the voice continued, cold and mocking. Ava didn't answer. She didn't give them the satisfaction of a heartbeat's hesitation. She clicked the radio off, her jaw set in stone, and moved again before the voice could pinpoint her location. The game had changed. This wasn't just a random raid on a medical outpost. This was a message. She took the back stairwell to the roof, her boots finding purchase on the ice-slicked metal. Up here, the wind was a physical wall, threatening to throw her off the edge of the building. A smuggler slipped on a patch of black ice near the HVAC units, his ribs cracking audibly against the steel housing. Ava was on him before he could even draw a breath to cry out. 7. The realization. Back inside the triage center, the atmosphere had shifted from panic to a grim, awestruck silence. The Marines were beginning to realize the pattern. Every time the smugglers tried to push a new hallway or flank a position, someone dropped. No spray of bullets, no frantic shouting, just clean, fast, surgical strikes. The young corporal who had spoken to Ava earlier looked at SGT. "Jackson, sir, whoever that is, they aren't missing, not once." Jackson stared at the door where Ava had disappeared, his hand tightening on his rifle. "No, they're not." The smugglers, now down nearly half their numbers, made their final fatal mistake. They split up. 2 of them pushed toward the generator room, desperate to plunge the entire facility into permanent darkness. 3 more went for triage, the heart of the hospital, driven by a mix of anger and reckless desperation. Ava didn't hesitate. She chose triage. She came down the maintenance stairwell like a wraith, stepping onto the wet floor as water dripped from her sleeves. The smugglers were moving in a tight formation, their rifles scanning the room. One of them turned too late, his eyes widening behind his goggles as he registered her stance, the way she held her weight, the way she didn't look like a nurse or a civilian or even a traditional soldier. He didn't even get a shot off. "Right." The last 2 tried to retreat, their confidence shattered by the sheer speed of the assault. They fumbled for the exit, but Ava was faster. She moved through the smoke and the rain of the sprinklers, her sidearm barking twice in the narrow space. 9. The weight of the silence. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The fire alarm timed out, leaving only the distant, muffled howl of the Alaskan wind and the steady drip, drip, drip of the sprinklers hitting the floor. Ava stood in the center of the hallway, her chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic tempo. She was counting. 9 neutralized inside the building, 3 outside in the snow earlier. 12. That number followed her like a shadow, the same number of men she'd lost in the valley 5 years ago. She holstered her weapon and stepped back into the flickering light of the main ward. A Marine, startled by the motion, whipped his rifle around, nearly pulling the trigger before he saw the light blue scrubs. "Jesus," he exhaled, his heart nearly jumping out of his chest. He lowered his weapon, staring at her in total shock, soaked to the bone, soot-stained, but with eyes as calm as a frozen lake. Who are you?" Before she could answer, the air began to thrum. It started as a low vibration in the floorboards, growing into a rhythmic beat that drowned out the wind. A heavy-lift transport helicopter was descending toward the landing pad, its rotors whipping the snow into a violent spiral. The cavalry had arrived, but for Ava, the real battle was just beginning. The Marines think the nightmare is over because the lights are back on, but Ava knows that once you've been called by your real name, there's nowhere left to hide. Every soldier has a ghost they can't outrun. Ava thought she'd buried hers in the Alaskan permafrost, but when that radio crackled, the past didn't just knock, it kicked the door down. The Marines think they've been saved. They don't realize the man stepping off that chopper isn't here to rescue them. He's here to reclaim a weapon they call the Ghost. And he isn't leaving without his property. The heavy-lift helicopter descended like a vengeful god, its rotors whipping the snow into a blinding white vortex. The skids hadn't even fully touched the landing pad before the side door slid open. Colonel Silas Vance stepped out into the freezing gale, his coat whipping around his legs, his face a landscape of hard lines and old scars. He didn't look like a man coming to save a hospital. He looked like a man surveying a crime scene. Vance took in the carnage in seconds, the white-clad bodies of the smugglers cooling in the snow, the bullet-riddled entrance, and the Marines standing in the foyer looking like they'd just seen a miracle. His gaze swept past SGT, Jackson and Captain Reed, dismissing them instantly. Then, his eyes locked on the woman standing in the shadows of the triage wing. Ava met his gaze evenly. She didn't salute. She didn't flinch. She just stood there with soot on her scrubs and blood on her hands, the weight of 1,000 miles between them. "Stand down," Vance ordered the room, his voice cutting through the hum of the rotors. Then, louder so every Marine could hear, "You're alive because of her." A murmur rippled through the soldiers. Miller looked from the colonel to the quiet nurse he'd spent months mocking. "Sir, she's a nurse," he stammered, his mind unable to bridge the gap between the woman who handed out aspirin and the shadow that had just dismantled a professional hit team. Vance didn't smile. It wasn't in his nature. "She's not here as a nurse," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "She's here so you don't die when things go wrong. The cost of survival." Ava looked away, the praise feeling like ash in her mouth. She hated that part, the moment the mask slipped and the world realized she wasn't normal. As the medical teams moved in to treat the wounded and the Marines began the grim task of securing the entry points, Vance stepped closer to her. "You did what you had to," he said quietly, his voice for her ears only. "I did what you trained me to do, Silas," she replied, her voice cold. "There's a difference." "They won't come back tonight," he said, ignoring her barb. "I know," she whispered, "because they learned." Outside, the storm began to ease, the wind losing its edge as if it had spent all its fury on the night's violence. Ava leaned against the cold tile wall, the adrenaline finally draining from her system, leaving a hollow, aching void in its place. Her hands began to tremble, not out of fear, but out of the sheer physical tax of being the ghost again. She closed her eyes for a brief second and didn't see the white walls of Fort Glacier. She saw the sand of the Helmand province. She saw the heat shimmer off a rifle barrel. She saw the faces of the 12 men she couldn't save back then, the real reason she counted her kills now. To her, Every life taken was a payment on a debt that could never be settled. The broken mirror. When she opened her eyes, the young corporal, the one who had frozen when the doors blew open, was standing in front of her. He held his helmet under his arm, looking smaller than he had yesterday. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hesitant and thick with guilt, "I thought nurses were supposed to save lives." Ava met his gaze, her expression softening just enough to let him in, but her voice remained unyielding. "So did I," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said in years. By morning, the hospital smelled of heavy-duty disinfectant and burnt wiring. The snow still pressed against the windows, but the light that filtered through was grey and unforgiving. Everything felt exposed. The voices were too quiet. Every step echoed like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The smugglers' bodies were gone, spirited away by Vance's observers, before the sun had even fully risen. They had moved with a clinical efficiency that left only bullet scars in the walls and darkened grout as proof that the night had ever happened. Ava stood at the sink in the staff restroom, washing her hands. She scrubbed until the skin was raw. She wasn't washing away dirt. She was trying to rinse the years off her skin. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw muzzle flashes where the IV stands should be. She heard the wind where she should have heard the steady rhythm of a heart monitor. And she counted, always counting. 12, she pressed her palms flat against the cold porcelain and breathed until the numbers faded back into the dark corners of her mind. "You should be resting," a voice said from the doorway. Ava didn't turn. She knew the weight of that silence. Vance stood there without his coat, just a man who had spent his life watching young soldiers die and women like Ava make sure they didn't. "So should your men," she countered. "My men are fine. They're Marines," Vance said, though the lie tasted bitter. "But you're a ghost, and ghosts don't stay in the light for long." The evidence of the map. In the command room, Vance laid out the tactical maps on a folding table. Red marks showed the smugglers' approach, blue marks showed Ava's movement. Every officer in the room noticed it. Her paths weren't random or desperate. They were anticipatory. "You predicted their split," Vance said, tapping the map where the hallway branched toward the generator room. "You knew when they'd panic. You knew when they'd push." Ava leaned against the back wall, her arms folded loosely over her chest. "They weren't here for medical supplies, sealers. Smugglers don't waste 12 men on gauze." "No," Vance agreed. "They were here for leverage." He looked at her, really looked at her, the kind of look that went past the scrubs and the stethoscope. And you knew that before the first shot was even fired. A veteran sergeant, his voice rough from the smoke he'd inhaled during the breach, spoke up from the corner. "Smugglers don't move like that. They were trained to fight military units." "They were," Ava said, her gaze drifting to the window where the snow was beginning to pile up again. "Who trained them?" the sergeant asked. Ava's voice was barely a whisper, but it filled the room like lead. "People who learn by losing, just like me." "The secret is out. The rookie nurse is dead, and the legend has taken her place. But in the world of shadows, once you're seen, you're a target, and the Northreach Syndicate doesn't like losing. They say the most dangerous moment in a war isn't the battle. It's the silence that follows." The Marines at Fort Glacier started to breathe again. They cleaned the floors, they patched the walls, and they thanked their lucky stars for the nurse with the iron aim. But Ava knew better. She knew that when a predator loses its pack, it doesn't run away. It calls for the rest of the wolves. And this time, they aren't coming for the medicine. They're coming to burn the map. By midday, a deceptive peace had settled over the outpost. The sun, a pale, heatless coin, hung low in the sky, reflecting off the pristine white snow that now covered the bloodstains of the night before. Inside, The heating system had been restored, filling the corridors with a dry, metallic warmth that smelled of old dust and survival. The Marines were high on the adrenaline of victory. Miller was sitting in the mess hall, his bandaged hand wrapped around a mug of coffee, telling anyone who would listen how Nurse Ava had taken out 3 guys before he could even blink. To them, the threat was over. The reinforcements had arrived, the colonel was in charge, and the storm was breaking. But Ava sat in the corner of the room, her eyes fixed on the door. She didn't have a coffee mug. She had a field-stripped pistol on the table in front of her, hidden beneath a cloth napkin. She watched the way the observers, Vance's elite team, moved. They weren't relaxing. They were scanning the rafters, checking the integrity of the reinforced glass, and whispering into encrypted comms. They knew what the Marines didn't. The Northreach Syndicate didn't leave witnesses, and they certainly didn't leave the ghost behind to tell tales. The trap is set. Colonel Vance walked into the mess hall, his face unreadable. He tapped the table in front of Ava. We're moving the wounded to the extraction transport in 20 minutes. I want you on that flight. Ava didn't look up. No. Vance leaned in, his voice a low vibration. This isn't a request, Ava. Your cover is blown. You're a liability to this facility now. If you stay, they'll keep coming until this place is a crater. If I leave on that chopper, you're giving them a target they can see from 10 miles away, Ava countered, finally meeting his eyes. You think they're gone? They're in the tree-line sealers. They're waiting for the bird to lift. Vance paused. He knew she was right, but his orders were to retrieve the asset. In the cold logic of the Pentagon, Ava wasn't a person. She was a specialized tool that had been lost and finally found. The transport has an escort, Vance said, though the conviction was missing from his voice. The transport is a coffin, Ava whispered. Suddenly, the base's internal sirens began to wail. It wasn't the frantic, under attack scream from the night before. It was a rhythmic, steady pulse. Communication blackout, SGT, Jackson shouted, running into the room. All external lines just went dead. Satellite, long-range radio, everything. The false hope vanished in an instant. The feeling of safety that had filled the room evaporated, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. The storm hadn't ended. It had just waited for them to let their guard down. The digital ghost. Ava didn't wait for orders. She stood up, the napkin falling away to reveal the weapon she'd been cleaning. She moved toward the server room, the brain of the hospital. If the syndicate had cut the lines, they hadn't done it from the outside. The snow was too deep, the perimeter too well guarded by Vance's men. They had done it from the inside. She reached the server room door and found it slightly ajar. No lock had been forced, no glass had been broken. Inside, a man in a technician's uniform was hunched over the main console. He wasn't one of the hospital's staff. He wasn't one of the Marines, and he definitely wasn't one of Vance's men. Step away from the terminal, Ava said, her voice as sharp as a razor. The man didn't turn around. He kept typing, his fingers flying across the keys with a frantic, rhythmic speed. You're late, Ghost, he said, his voice distorted by a small electronic device at his throat. The upload is already at 90%. Upload of what? The man finally turned, a twisted, jagged grin spreading across his face. He wasn't a soldier. He was a burner, a digital specialist hired to erase data by any means necessary. The patient files, Ava, the real ones, the ones that show why this hospital actually exists in the middle of nowhere. Ava's heart went cold. Fort Glacier wasn't just a medical outpost. It was a black site recovery center for deep cover agents, people like her who needed a place to disappear and heal. If those files got out, every operative in the Northern Hemisphere would be burned. Their families, their lives, their secrets, all of it would be for sale to the highest bidder. "Stop it," she commanded, raising her weapon. "Or what, you'll kill me," the burner laughed. "I'm already dead, look at the door." Ava glanced back just as a heavy magnetic lock engaged. A thick, reinforced steel shutter slammed down over the doorway, sealing them both inside the server room. The narrowing paths. Outside, the base erupted into chaos again. Explosions rocked the landing pad, not from the sky, but from charges planted beneath the ice. The transport helicopter, the one Vance had promised would be their salvation, was engulfed in a ball of orange flame, its rotors spinning wildly until they sheared off and sliced through the hangar doors. Inside the server room, the air was getting thin. The cooling fans for the servers had reversed, pumping hot, dry air into the small space. 95%, the burner whispered, his eyes gleaming with a fanatic's light. Ava didn't shoot him, that's what he wanted. He wanted a quick end before the heat took them. Instead, she moved to the primary junction box. She didn't know the password to stop the upload, but she knew the one thing that governed all machines. Increase intensity and pace. She didn't use her gun. She used her bare hands, tearing at the high-voltage cables, the sparks showering her scrubs and scorching her skin. "What are you doing? You'll fry the whole system," the burner screamed, lunging for her. Ava kicked him back, her boot catching him square in the chest. With a final, desperate heave, she ripped the main power coupling from the wall. The room went pitch black, the hum of the servers died, the flickering green light of the upload progress bar vanished. "Silence! You've only delayed it," the burner hissed in the dark. "The syndicate is already in the building. They don't need the upload if they have the hard drives, and they don't need the hard drives if they have you." Ava stood in the dark, her hands throbbing with the sting of electrical burns. She could hear the muffled sound of gunfire returning to the hallways outside. The false hope was gone, the fortress was breached, and now she was trapped in a box with the man who had sold them all out. The hospital is a cage, the exit is a fireball, and the only person who can save the Marines is locked in a room that's slowly becoming a furnace. They say you don't know who a person is until you take away their light. In the pitch black of the server room, the nurse was gone. There was only a weapon designed to function in the dark. Outside, the hospital is burning. Inside, the oxygen is failing. The syndicate thinks they've trapped a mouse. They don't realize they've locked themselves in a cage with a ghost who has nothing left to lose. Tonight, the ice doesn't just freeze, it cuts. The air in the server room was becoming a physical weight. Every breath Ava took tasted of ozone, scorched plastic, and the metallic tang of the burner's sweat. The heat from the dying servers radiated off the racks like a fever. "You think you won?" the burner wheezed from the corner. He was slumped against a rack of blinking hard drives, his face slick with perspiration. "My team, they don't leave survivors. They'll blast through that door in 5 minutes, and they'll start with your fingers." Ava didn't answer. She was standing by the reinforced steel shutter, her ear pressed to the metal. She wasn't listening for her rescue, she was listening for the rhythm of the massacre outside. Pop, pop, pause, screaming, pop. The syndicate was moving through the triage wing with systematic cruelty. They weren't just looking for the drives, they were punishing the Marines for the men they'd lost earlier. Ava looked at the burner. 5 minutes is a long time, she said softly. She moved to the ventilation duct near the ceiling. It was too small for a man, but Ava had spent her life being small enough to be overlooked. She tore the metal grate away with a screech of protesting steel that set her teeth on edge. "You're leaving me here," the burner gasped, realization dawning. "I'm giving you exactly what you gave my friends in the valley," Ava said, her voice devoid of emotion. A front row seat to the end. The crawl. The duct was a frozen coffin. The air inside was a stark contrast to the furnace of the server room, sharp, icy, and smelling of old rust. Ava pulled herself through the narrow space, her shoulders scraping against the rivets, her fingers numbing as she gripped the cold metal. She could hear them now. The smugglers were in the hallway directly below her. "Check the rooms, kill anyone in a uniform," a voice barked. Ava paused, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was directly above the main corridor. Through a small gap in the ductwork, she saw SGT Jackson. He was pinned behind a reception desk, his ammunition low, his face covered in soot. Beside him, the young corporal, the one who wanted to be a hero, was staring at a bleeding wound in his shoulder, his eyes glazed with shock. Ava's hand moved to her sidearm. She could take 2 from here, maybe 3, but it wouldn't be enough. The syndicate had brought in the heavy hitters, men in full ballistic armor carrying submachine guns. She needed a force multiplier. She kept crawling, navigating toward the medical gas storage. She knew the layout of Fort Glacier better than the architects. She knew that the oxygen and nitrous oxide tanks were kept in a pressurized room with a shared wall to the server corridor. If she couldn't outgun them, she would outphysics them. The bridge. She dropped out of the vent into the gas storage room, landing with the silent grace of a predatory cat. The room was humming with the sound of pressurized valves. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy wrench from the maintenance kit and began loosening the seals on the primary oxygen manifolds. The hiss of escaping gas filled the room, a high-pitched whistle that sounded like a warning. "Stay calm, one breath." She checked her watch. The syndicate would be at the server room door in 60 seconds. She pulled a flare from her tactical belt, the one Vance had given her for emergencies. She didn't light it, not yet. She stepped out into the hallway, moving through the shadows like a wisp of smoke. The smugglers were stacked up at the server room door, preparing a thermal charge to melt the magnetic lock. "Clear the hall," their leader shouted. Ava stepped into the light. "Looking for me?" she asked. The 6 men turned as one, their rifles swinging toward her. In their eyes, she was a cornered nurse. In her eyes, they were already dead. Ava didn't fire her gun. She threw the flare, unlit, at their feet. "Flare," one shouted, instinctively flinching. In that split second of distraction, Ava dived back into the gas room and slammed the reinforced door. As she hit the floor, she fired a single shot through the small observation window into the hallway, aimed directly at the thermal charge the smugglers had just set. The explosion wasn't just fire, it was a vacuum. The oxygen-rich air in the hallway ignited with a roar that shook the very foundations of the hospital. A wall of blue and orange flame swept down the corridor, incinerating everything in its path. The smugglers didn't even have time to scream. The pressure wave blew the server room door inward, instantly silencing the burner and his secrets. The darkest hour. When the ringing in Ava's ears finally stopped, the silence was absolute. She pushed open the door to the hallway. The walls were blackened, the floor littered with the smoldering remains of tactical gear. The smoke was so thick it felt like walking through soup. She stepped over the bodies, her boots crunching on broken glass. She found SGT, Jackson, and the corporal. They had been shielded by the heavy reception desk, but the shockwave had knocked them unconscious. Ava knelt by the corporal, checking his pulse. It was thready, but it was there. "Live," she whispered, pressing a clean bandage to his shoulder. "You don't get to quit yet." But as she stood up, a shadow moved at the end of the hall. It wasn't a smuggler, it was Colonel Vance. He was leaning against the wall, a dark stain spreading across his white shirt. His eyes were hollow, his breathing ragged. They have a backup team, Ava, he coughed, blood flecking his lips. Coming from the ridge. They aren't here for the drives anymore, they're here for the witness. Ava looked at the man who had made her a ghost. Then let them come, sealers. You can't stay, Vance wheezed. Go to the basement, the old tunnel, it leads to the ravine. I'm not leaving the Marines, Ava said, her voice hard as the Alaskan permafrost. That's an order, soldier, Vance growled, a flicker of his old authority returning. Ava looked at him, then at the unconscious boys behind the desk. She knew the syndicate. If she stayed, they would level the building to get to her. If she ran, they would follow the ghost. She was the bait, she was the target, and she was the only way these men lived to see the sunrise. She didn't say goodbye. She just turned and vanished into the smoke, heading down toward the cold, dark heart of the mountain. The hospital is quiet, but the ridge is alive. The wolves have seen their prey slip into the trees. They think the snow will slow her down. They don't realize the snow is the only place she feels at home. They thought the hospital was the cage. They were wrong. The Alaskan wilderness is a cathedral of ice, and tonight it's holding a funeral. The syndicate sent their backup team, their erasers, to finish the job. They think they're hunting a nurse in the woods. They don't realize they've just entered the only place on Earth where the ghost is truly invincible. The hunt doesn't end with a surrender. It ends with the snow turning red. The emergency tunnel was a relic of the Cold War, a narrow, concrete throat that bled out into a jagged ravine 300 yards from the hospital's perimeter. Ava emerged into the night, and the Alaskan winter hit her like a physical blow. The wind didn't just blow, it searched for any patch of exposed skin to bite and blacken. She wasn't wearing scrubs anymore. She had stripped down to her tactical thermals, her body lean and corded with muscle that had been hidden under the baggy hospital cotton for months. Around her waist was the gear she'd recovered from the server room, 3 magazines, 2 flashbangs, and a serrated blade that felt like an extension of her own arm. She didn't run. Running makes you breathe heavy. Breathing heavy creates a trail of steam. She moved with the ghost walk, a rhythmic, low center of gravity stride that disturbed the snow as little as possible. Behind her, the hospital was a silhouette of flickering orange embers against the purple-black sky. Suddenly, the sky ignited. A magnesium flare hissed overhead, bathing the ravine in a harsh, artificial white light. Ava didn't freeze. She dropped, rolling into the hollow of a fallen cedar, her white camo cloak pulled from the tunnel storage, blending her into the landscape. There by the tree line, a voice shouted, amplified by a tactical headset. The syndicate's backup team wasn't interested in the hospital. They were the cleanup crew, 6 men, equipped with thermal optics and suppressed short-stroke rifles. They moved in a wide semicircle, designed to flush her toward the frozen river at the base of the ravine. Ava watched them through the pine needles. She didn't feel fear. She felt the cold logic. 6 targets, 2 with thermals, 1 marksman on the high ridge. Distance, 50 meters. Visibility fluctuating. She needed to take out the thermals first. Without their tech, they were just men in the dark. The ice ghost. The lead eraser stepped over a frozen log, his rifle scanning the brush. He was using a high-end FLIR unit. To him, the world was a wash of blue, and Ava should have been a bright, glowing orange heat signature. But he didn't see her. Ava had spent the last 3 minutes packing her tactical vest with snow, lowering her external body temperature. She had become a part of the mountain. She rose from the snow directly behind him, a literal shadow emerging from the white. She didn't use a gun. The sound would give away her exact coordinates to the marksman. She reached around, covering his mouth with a gloved hand, while the blade found the gap between his helmet and his vest. 10, she breathed into his ear. He went limp. She caught his rifle before it hit the ground, gently lowering him into the drift. She grabbed his thermal goggles and slid them over her eyes. The world turned into a map of heat. She saw the other 5. They were spread out, confident, thinking their lead man was just lagging behind. She moved to the second target, the one near the frozen creek. He was focused on the shadows under the bridge. Ava didn't even slow down. She ghosted through the brush, her movements synchronized with the howling gusts of wind. She used the marksman's own tactic against him. She waited for a heavy gust to blow, masking the sound, and then she fired a single suppressed round from the stolen rifle. 11. The breaking point. The marksman on the ridge saw his man go down in the thermal feed. Contact, West Bank, she's got the gear. The hunters became the hunted. The syndicate team scrambled for cover, but there is no cover in a ravine when the predator is above you. Ava had already scaled the icy rock face, her fingers bleeding but her grip ironclad. She reached the ridge before the marksman could recalibrate. He heard a crunch of snow behind him, not the sound of a footstep, but the sound of a deliberate choice. He turned, but Ava was already midair. She tackled him, the two of them tumbling down the steep embankment in a chaotic tangle of limbs and gear. They hit a ledge 20 feet down with a bone-jarring thud. The marksman was a big man, a mercenary who had fought in 3 different continents. He scrambled for his sidearm, his face contorted in a snarl of rage. "You're just a girl in a uniform," he spat. Ava caught his wrist, her eyes locking onto his with a terrifying, empty stare. "I'm the person who decides if you ever go home," she said. She twisted. A sickening pop echoed in the small space. He screamed, but the wind tore the sound from his throat. She didn't finish him. She didn't need to. In this cold, with a broken arm and no gear, the mountain would do the work for her. 12. She took his long-range radio and keyed the frequency she'd heard in the server room. "This is the Ghost," she said, her voice steady and low. "Tell your handlers the hospital is off limits. Tell them if they ever come back to Alaska, I won't just kill the men they send. I'll come for the people who sent them." There was a long silence on the other end. Then a voice, the same cold, mocking voice from the night, responded. "You're one woman, Ava. We are an empire." "An empire is just a collection of targets," Ava replied. She smashed the radio against the rock. The remaining 3 smugglers were closing in on her position at the ledge. They were desperate now, firing blindly into the trees, their discipline shattered by the invisible toll she was taking. Ava looked up at the stars. The storm was finally breaking. The clouds were parting to reveal a cold, indifferent moon. She had one flashbang left. She waited until they were all within 10 yards, huddled together for a final push. She pulled the pin and counted. 1, 2, 3. She tossed it. The world turned into a blinding white scream. Ava didn't wait for the smoke to clear. She moved through the disorientation like a vengeful spirit. 3 shots, 3 pulses of light in the dark. 13, 14, 15. The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a job finished. Ava stood in the center of the ravine, her chest heaving, the adrenaline finally beginning to subside. She looked back toward Fort Glacier. The fire had been extinguished. The secondary lights were coming on. She saw the silhouettes of the Marines, Miller, Jackson, and the others moving along the perimeter. They were alive. She had done it. She had paid the debt. But as she looked at her hands, she knew she couldn't go back. She couldn't put the scrubs back on. She couldn't be Nurse Ava anymore. The ghost had been summoned, and she didn't know how to make it disappear. The snow will cover the bodies. The wind will blow away the scent of gunpowder. The Marines will tell stories about the nurse who saved them, but they will never see her again. Because once you step into the dark to save the light, the dark never lets you go. The storm has passed, but the air at Fort Glacier will never be the same. They'll look for her in the morning. They'll check the rosters, the security feeds, and the snow-filled ravines, but the ghost doesn't leave a trail. She only leaves survivors. The Marines have their lives, the Syndicate has their warning, and Ava has another horizon, because in a world of loud monsters, it's the quiet ones you need to fear the most. By the time the sun finally pulled itself over the Alaskan horizon, the hospital felt like a place holding its breath. The generators hummed with a steady, almost apologetic rhythm, as if trying to erase the memory of the darkness. Outside, the perimeter was a mess of boot prints and tire tracks, the frantic signatures of a night that shouldn't have happened. Ava stood at the exit, her gear packed into a single, nondescript bag. She had changed back into her scrubs one last time to make her final rounds. She moved through the trauma wing like a shadow, checking vitals and adjusting drips with the same surgical precision she'd used to dismantle the Syndicate. When she reached the room of the youngest Marine, the one who had frozen when the doors blew open, she found him awake. He wasn't staring at the ceiling anymore. He was staring at his hands, trying to understand how they were still there. "You're up early," Ava said, her voice a soft anchor in the quiet room. "Didn't sleep," he admitted, looking up. He hesitated, his voice thick with the kind of awe that borders on fear. "They're saying things about you that you weren't supposed to be here." Ava adjusted his IV rate, her expression unreadable. "I was exactly where I needed to be." That seemed to settle it for him. He exhaled a breath he'd been holding since the first gunshot. He didn't need to know her rank or her history. He just needed to know that the person who saved him meant to do it. The paper trail. In the command office, Colonel Vance, his side bandaged and his face pale, was staring at a folder that was mostly black ink and redacted lines. He looked up as Ava entered. "The delegation from higher command is 10 minutes out," he said, handing her a folded piece of paper. "It's a medical transfer, temporary, no destination listed." Ava raised an eyebrow as she scanned the document. "That's sloppy sealers." "It's intentional," Vance countered. "If anyone asks, you were reassigned before the incident concluded. We're burying this, Ava, for your sake and ours." "And if they ask why 12 Marines are alive who should be dead?" Ava asked. Vance met her gaze with a weary, respectful smile. "I'll tell them the truth, that you are here for our protection, not the other way around." Ava studied him for a long moment. She saw the cost of that lie in the lines around his eyes. Commanders were paid in consequences, and Vance was settling the bill for her. "You kept your men alive, Colonel," she said softly. "No," he corrected, shaking his head. "I just made room for them to survive. You were the shield." The vanishing. Ava walked down the long, sanitized hallway toward the exit. She passed a group of Marines, the same men who had laughed at her soft hands only 48 hours ago. They didn't laugh now. As she passed, they stood up. They didn't salute. That would have been too official, too loud, but they nodded in a silent, collective acknowledgement of a debt they could never repay. She felt a tightness in her chest, an unwelcome ripple of emotion that she quickly pushed back into the dark. Outside, the cold hit her like a reminder. An unmarked vehicle was idling beyond the floodlights, its exhaust blooming in the frigid air. The driver didn't ask her name. He didn't need to. As the vehicle rolled forward, Ava looked back one last time. The hospital stood solid against the white Alaskan waste, its lights glowing warm and defiant against the dark. She saw the silhouettes of Marines moving along the perimeter, alert, focused, and most importantly, alive. For the first time in a long while, she let herself believe she had left something better behind. Miles later, as Fort Glacier disappeared into the snow and distance, Ava leaned her head against the window. The reflection staring back at her looked older than her years, calmer and more tired than she felt. She thought about the night, the first shot, the last one, and the spaces in between where everything could have gone wrong. She thought about the kills she no longer counted, and the lives she still did. She thought about the nurse she'd been pretending to be, and the soldier she had never really stopped being. Somewhere ahead, another quiet corner of the world would need her. Danger would arrive wearing a different face, and she would be there, perhaps in scrubs, perhaps not. It didn't matter. What mattered was the moment between fear and action. That was where she lived. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that the quietest people in the room often carry the heaviest weight, then stay with us. These stories only survive when someone chooses to listen. If you want more cinematic tales of the ghosts who walk among us, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Tell us in the comments, what would you do if the person you trusted the least was the only one who could save you? Until the next mission, stay alert, stay alive.